Story 1. There was nothing particularly thrilling about our plans that night. Just a group of friends killing time in a sleepy beach town during the off-season. Winters here were always quiet, the kind of quiet that gets under your skin and makes you desperate for something to do. Urban exploring wasn't new to us. We weren't reckless, but we liked the occasional adrenaline rush that came with poking around abandoned spots. So when someone suggested the old restaurant by the shore, it seemed like the perfect way to pass the time. Getting in was easy enough. The place had been closed for years, its windows boarded up except for one that had been shattered on the shore-facing side. We chose that entrance, ducking through the broken glass to avoid being spotted from the main road. The cold wind off the ocean followed us inside, bringing with it the faint smell of salt and decay. Once inside, though, the place was mostly what we expected: empty, dusty, and quiet. The dining area was the first thing we explored. Tables were tipped over and scattered across the room, their legs splintered and frames warped from years of neglect. The bar stretched along one wall, its surface still lined with cracked coasters and a few dusty bottles that hadn't been moved since the place shut down. It wasn't particularly creepy, just sad, a hollowed-out shell of what had once been lively and full of people. After spending some time poking around upstairs, we spotted a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. "Wine cellar," someone said excitedly, and we didn't hesitate to head down. The stairs were steep, creaking with every step, and the air grew colder the deeper we descended. At first, the cellar seemed straightforward: a few dusty shelves lined with empty wine bottles, some toppled over, others still standing neatly as though waiting for someone to return. Then the hallways began. The basement was deceptively larger than we'd expected, a labyrinth of narrow hallways branching off from the main cellar. The more we explored, the less it felt like we were in a restaurant. The ceilings got lower, the walls closer together, and the twists and turns started to feel claustrophobic. Our flashlights bounced off the peeling paint and exposed pipes, each beam illuminating only small patches of the dark ahead. We rounded a corner and found ourselves in a larger room, its door slightly ajar, as though inviting us inside. One of my friends stepped in first, shining his flashlight across the walls. "Nothing here," he muttered, the light sweeping across stacks of old crates and discarded furniture. Then his beam caught something in the corner. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping. The flashlight steadied, and we all followed its path. At first, it didn't register. Just a cot, unmade and tucked into the corner. Nothing inherently alarming about it. Then we saw what was on it and around it. Clothes neatly folded, a safety razor resting next to a cracked mirror, a few scattered belongings worn but clearly used. The realization hit all of us at once. We were in someone's living space. Not a place someone had lived, but a place someone still did. My stomach dropped. "We need to leave," I said immediately, my voice low but urgent. No one argued. We backed out of the room as quietly as we could, flashlight beams darting nervously toward the shadows as we tried to retrace our steps. Every creak of the floorboards under our feet felt too loud, every whisper of the wind through the cracks above like a warning. The thought of whoever lived down there, whether they were watching us, whether they'd return at any moment, was enough to make my pulse race. When we finally climbed back up the stairs, the cold air from outside hit us like a wave of relief. We didn't stop to look back, didn't take another moment to admire the restaurant's decaying charm. We climbed out the broken window and didn't say a word until we were back on the main road, the wind whipping around us as we walked quickly away. I don't know who was living down there, or why they'd chosen such an unsettling place to call home. Maybe they were harmless, maybe they weren't. But I learned that night that the scariest part of exploring abandoned places isn't the emptiness. It's the possibility that you're not alone. Story 2. The old mental hospital was something of a local legend. Everyone in town had a story about it. Ghost sightings, strange noises, shadows moving in the windows at night. It was one of those places that teenagers dared each other to visit, but rarely did. For my friends and me, though, it wasn't our first rodeo. Exploring abandoned places was kind of our thing, and this hospital, with its broken windows and eerie reputation, had been on our list for months. We chose a quiet evening, just after sunset. The streets were empty, and the hospital loomed over the tree line like some forgotten relic of a bygone era. Getting in was easy enough. A chain-link fence that had long since been cut open, a side door that barely hung on its hinges. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The first thing we noticed was how much the place had decayed. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, and the floor was littered with debris, shards of broken glass, pieces of furniture, and scraps of paper whose writing had long since faded. We explored the ground floor first, taking in the graffiti-covered walls and the remnants of what must have been the patient intake area. It was creepy, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary for an abandoned building. Then we found the room. Tucked at the end of a long hallway, it looked like it might have been a break room or some kind of common area back in the day. But what caught our attention was the setup. There were a few folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, 2 old mattresses pushed against the far wall, and piles of blankets and clothes that looked far too recent to have been left behind from the hospital's operational days. Someone had been here, and possibly still was. We hesitated for a moment, our flashlights flickering over the scene. "Looks like someone's living here," one of my friends said quietly. None of us answered. We didn't touch anything, didn't linger long. We felt a little guilty intruding, but curiosity pulled us further into the building. The upper floors were less claustrophobic. We found graffiti murals that sprawled across entire walls, colorful and chaotic against the hospital's drab interior. The view from the roof was worth the climb, a panorama of the town and the forest beyond, bathed in the orange and purple hues of the setting sun. For a moment, we forgot about the room downstairs, the feeling that we might not be alone in the building. We spent about 45 minutes exploring before deciding to head back. The shadows in the hallways seemed darker on the way down, and the air felt colder, heavier. We didn't say much as we descended, the sound of our footsteps echoing faintly in the silence. When we reached the break room again, we stopped dead in our tracks. The chairs were gone, or more accurately, they weren't where we'd found them. They had been neatly folded and stacked against the wall, almost like someone was tidying up. The mattresses were still there, but they looked different too. The blankets were spread out evenly, the clothes arranged in neat piles. It looked deliberate, intentional, as though someone had been there the moment we'd left and worked quickly to rearrange everything. None of us said a word at first. We just stood there, frozen, the realization sinking in. Whoever had done this had either been watching us or had waited for us to leave. And now, as we stood there staring at the neatly arranged chairs and blankets, the feeling of being watched hit us like a cold wave. "Let's go," I said, my voice low but firm. We didn't need to be told twice. We moved quickly, trying not to make too much noise as we retraced our steps to the ground floor. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the broken windows set my nerves on edge. The building suddenly felt alive, like it was breathing us out, pushing us toward the exit. By the time we reached the door we'd come in through, my heart was racing. I half expected to see someone waiting for us outside, watching from the shadows. But the yard was empty, the town quiet. We slipped through the fence and didn't stop walking until we were a good distance away, the hospital fading into the darkness behind us. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of those dark hallways, the silence that followed us out. It wasn't the idea of ghosts or spirits that scared me. It was the thought of a real person, silent and deliberate, watching us without making a sound. That abandoned hospital wasn't empty, and for the first time in all our urban exploring adventures, I wasn't eager to go back and find out who, or what, had shared the space with us. Story 3. The flour mill on Harbor Island had been on our list for months. It was one of those places everyone in Seattle whispered about, abandoned, locked up tight, and supposedly haunted. My friends and I were deep in our urban exploration phase back then, sneaking into forgotten buildings and dodging the occasional cop. The mill was the crown jewel of our adventures, and we finally worked up the nerve to check it out one cold, overcast night. Getting in wasn't as hard as we thought. A section of the chain-link fence had been cut open, and the back door, though rusted, gave way with a little force. The air inside was thick with dust, the kind that clings to your throat and makes you cough if you breathe too deeply. The place was massive, rows of rusted machinery, conveyor belts frozen in time, and broken windows that let in just enough moonlight to cast eerie shadows across the walls. We started in the main factory floor, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we picked our way over broken glass and debris. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, mixing with the occasional creak of the building settling. It was creepy, sure, but nothing we hadn't dealt with before. We were laughing, joking, trying to shake off the tension that always came with exploring places like this. Then our buddy Jake stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. We froze, flashlights pointed at the ground, and listened. At first, all I could hear was the wind whistling through the broken windows and the distant hum of the city outside. But then faintly there it was, a shuffling sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the concrete floor. My heart started pounding. The sound was faint but deliberate, too steady to be the wind. We exchanged nervous glances, and I could see the same thought reflected in everyone's eyes. We're not alone. We moved slowly, carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Every step felt agonizingly loud, the crunch of glass and dirt underfoot echoing like gunshots in the stillness. The shuffling grew louder as we approached the stairwell at the far end of the room. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere near the stairs, but the shadows made it impossible to tell for sure. Jake shined his flashlight up and down the stairwell, the beam flickering as it passed over the adjacent landings. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. Just the sound, still there, still dragging. Then it happened. One of my friends, Matt, turned around and stepped on an old water bottle. The crackling sound it made was deafening, shattering the fragile silence we'd been holding on to. Another friend, Alex, startled by the noise, spun around and yelled, "Fuck!" at the top of his lungs. And that's when we heard it. A scream, deep, guttural, and inhuman. It came from somewhere in the darkness, reverberating through the mill like a shockwave. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. It was too raw, too primal, like something out of a nightmare. My blood ran cold, and for a split second, none of us moved. Then instinct took over. We ran. We didn't look back, didn't stop to figure out where the scream had come from or what had made it. We just bolted, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted toward the exit. The sound of our footsteps drowned out everything else, but in the back of my mind, I swore I could still hear that scream, chasing us through the darkness. We burst out into the night, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests. No one said a word as we scrambled through the hole in the fence and back to the safety of the streetlights. It wasn't until we were halfway home that someone finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. None of us had an answer. We tried to laugh it off, to convince ourselves it was just the wind or some animal. But deep down, we all knew better. Whatever was in that mill with us that night, it wasn't something we could explain. And it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. I haven't been back to Harbor Island since. The flour mill still stands, its broken windows staring out over the water like empty eyes. Story 4. It was one of those nights where you could feel the chill creeping in as soon as the sun went down. A Friday, if I remember correctly. My friends and I had this spot we used to go to, an old cemetery tucked behind the high school in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't much to look at, just old weathered gravestones and a few overgrown trees. A perfect spot for us to drive out to when we had nothing else to do. We'd sneak out late, grab a few beers, and hang out just to kill time. That night was different, though. I could tell as soon as we pulled up. There was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was just the atmosphere. Dead silence, no one around. Nothing but the sound of the gravel crunching under our tires. The usual creepy vibe, but this time it felt thicker somehow. James, who was always the one pushing us to do stupid shit, was already out of the car, laughing, half drunk. "Let's check the old part of the cemetery," he said, pointing toward the back where the stones were so old you could barely read the names. I wasn't sure, but he was already moving toward the overgrown path, so I followed, not wanting to seem like a scared kid. We didn't even make it 10 feet before I noticed her. This woman standing near the edge of the cornfield behind the cemetery. At first I thought she was just a passerby, maybe out for a walk or something. But she wasn't moving. She was just standing there staring into the cornfield. I could see her clearly, even though the moonlight was dim. Dark coat, long hair, too still. It didn't make sense. "Hey, do you see that?" I whispered to James, my voice catching in my throat. He looked over, squinting. "Yeah, what the hell is she doing out there?" His voice was nervous now, the same nervous energy I felt creeping up my spine. She didn't even seem to notice us standing there, watching her. It was like we weren't even in the same world. I wanted to call out to her, but my mouth felt dry. I didn't know why, but something about the way she stood there. It felt wrong, like something was about to happen. And then she turned, slowly, methodically. Not like someone just turning to look, but like she had made a conscious decision to move, like she knew exactly where she was going. She didn't walk toward us, though. She didn't look at us. She just turned and stepped into the cornfield, disappearing into the darkness without a sound. "Let's get out of here," I muttered, already backing up. I felt a pit in my stomach, like a bad omen. James didn't argue. We got in the car, and I couldn't help but look over my shoulder as we pulled away. There was no sign of her. The field was just empty. But something still felt off, like something in that place had changed. We didn't talk much the rest of the way back to town. When we got home, I tried to shake it off. The usual routine. Pretend nothing had happened, go to bed, forget about it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Standing in that field, her face just out of reach, but her eyes, I couldn't forget the way she moved. She was there, standing in the field, not a care in the world. And then, just like that, she was gone. No explanation, no reason. I don't go near that cemetery anymore. Story 5. There's this colossal, abandoned building in my city. More than 40 acres of rusted steel and crumbling brick. A monument to whatever industry had died there decades ago. For as long as I can remember, it's been a hotspot for urban explorers, mostly because of one big quirk. The cops won't follow you inside. They'll just hang back and wait for you to come out. Something about its size, or maybe just the vibes, makes it easier to let you chase yourself through the labyrinth of corridors and shadows. The second time I went was in the middle of the night, around 3 a.m. That hour when even the city feels like it's holding its breath. There were 3 of us, me, my buddy Ryan, and his younger cousin Ethan, who was tagging along for the first time. None of us were new to exploring, but Ethan was jittery, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as we searched for a way in. We found an opening through a collapsed section of wall near the amphitheater, an outdoor courtyard area with tiered stone seating that had long since been swallowed by weeds and decay. The sheer size of the building made it impossible to enter without feeling like you were walking into a mouth that was waiting to close behind you. We crossed the amphitheater, crunching over gravel and debris, and stopped at a set of boarded-up windows. "Think this leads inside?" Ryan whispered, testing the edge of the plywood. It didn't budge. We were about to try another section when we all froze. There was a sound, faint but unmistakable. A voice, muffled, like someone muttering on the other side of the plywood. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We strained our ears, our flashlights pointed at the ground to keep the beams from giving us away. The building creaked and groaned in the wind. But underneath it, you could hear something else. Someone. Talking. Not to us, not yelling. Just a low, monotone string of words that didn't make sense. "Is it a security guard?" I whispered. Ryan shook his head. "There's no way. They don't guard this place anymore." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. The voice didn't get louder, didn't come closer. It just kept murmuring, like the person was locked in a one-sided conversation with no one in particular. "Let's check it out," Ethan said, trying to sound braver than he looked. "No." My voice was firmer than I expected it to be. "We need to leave." "Come on, it's probably just some homeless guy," Ryan said. But even he didn't sound convinced. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a step back, away from the window. The voice, whatever or whoever it belonged to, kept going, a steady stream of words I couldn't make out. And something about the cadence made my chest tighten, like the rhythm was wrong, too fast, too constant, like it wasn't stopping to breathe. "Let's go," I said again, more urgently this time. I didn't care if I looked scared. Whatever was behind that plywood, I didn't want to meet it. Ryan hesitated for a second longer, then nodded. Ethan didn't argue. We turned and started walking back toward the amphitheater, moving faster now, our footsteps crunching louder against the gravel. None of us spoke, but every so often one of us would glance back, as if expecting to see something or someone following us. When we reached the edge of the amphitheater, Ethan stopped. "Did you see that?" he asked, his flashlight pointed back toward the boarded-up window. "See what?" Ryan asked. "I thought I saw—" Ethan trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind." We didn't wait to figure it out. We climbed back through the hole in the wall and into the cold night air, the city lights in the distance casting just enough of a glow to guide us back to the street. It wasn't until we were a block away that I realized I was holding my breath. I haven't been back to that building since, and I don't plan to. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and I'm fine leaving that particular mystery unsolved. Whatever was behind that plywood can stay there, talking to the dark long after the rest of the city forgets it even exists. Story 6. The decommissioned naval base wasn't exactly a secret in my town. It had been sitting there for years, its barracks slowly decaying, its grounds empty except for the occasional urban explorer. When my friends and I were in high school, it was the kind of place we gravitated toward, especially late at night when the whole town fell asleep, and we could act like we owned the darkness. We weren't reckless. We avoided the parts that looked structurally dangerous, but exploring forgotten places had become our thing. The night in question was typical for us. We'd parked far enough away not to be suspicious, slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, and followed the overgrown path toward the barracks. The air was cool and damp, and the silence hung heavy, broken only by our footsteps crunching over gravel and the occasional whisper as we pointed out something interesting. A broken light fixture, an overturned bunk, graffiti from explorers who'd come before us. The barracks themselves were eerie but not outright terrifying. Rows of empty rooms lined the dim hallways, their doors mostly open, their interiors stripped bare except for the occasional rusted bed frame or discarded locker. The place smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, a combination that felt nostalgic in a strange way. We were laughing, shining our flashlights at each other, joking about ghosts and long-forgotten sailors. That's when I saw it. I turned a corner into one of the hallways, my flashlight beam sweeping over the floor, and stopped cold. There, lying on the ground just a few feet ahead, was a cigarette. Literature. The orange glow of the tip was faint but unmistakable, a stark contrast to the shadowy surroundings. It wasn't smoking. Whoever had been holding it had either dropped it or placed it there deliberately. But the thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone was here. Not someone who had been here, but someone who was here right now. "Guys," I whispered sharply, my voice trembling. "Look." My friends stopped behind me, their flashlights bouncing off the walls as they turned toward where I was pointing. The silence stretched thinner, tighter, as each of us realized what we were looking at. Ryan, who was always the loud one, muttered, "What the hell?" We didn't say much after that. The possibility of not being alone had shifted the dynamic entirely. Every creak of the building now felt amplified. Every shadow took on a sinister edge. The air seemed colder, heavier. We stood there for a moment, barely breathing, straining to hear or see anything that would confirm what our guts already told us. Someone was nearby. Ethan leaned toward the cigarette, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. Do we try to find them?" I pulled him back. "Number, we leave." Nobody argued. There wasn't a single sound or movement that could have convinced us to stay. The thought of whoever had dropped that cigarette, why they hadn't shown themselves, why they were silent, was enough to send us into full retreat. We turned back, moving quickly and quietly through the maze of hallways, our flashlights bouncing off the walls as we tried not to trip over debris. Every door we passed felt like it might open at any second. Every empty room felt like it might contain eyes that were watching us. When we made it outside, the cold air hit me hard, my lungs burning as I realized I'd been holding my breath. We didn't stop until we were back at the car, the fence in the building disappearing behind us. No one said a word as we climbed in and started driving away, the tension still thick in the silence. It wasn't until we were halfway home that Ryan finally spoke. "Do you think they were hiding, or—" His voice trailed off, leaving the question hanging in the air. I didn't answer. None of us did. Because the truth is, I didn't want to know. I didn't want to think about why someone would drop a lit cigarette and vanish without a trace, why they wouldn't make their presence known, or what their intentions might have been. The mystery was enough, and it was one I was happy to leave unsolved. Story 7. Topanga Canyon. If you've been there, you know. The roads twist and curve through dense hills, the houses perched like afterthoughts on the edges of cliffs or buried deep in the trees. The kind of place that feels alive at night, like the land itself is watching you. My girlfriend lived up there when we were in high school, and every visit felt like I was stepping into another world. A little eerie, a little magical, and a lot unpredictable. This one night, I was leaving her house after a late dinner. It was close to midnight, and the only way to get to my car was to walk down one of those signature Topanga roads, a barely there single-lane strip of cracked asphalt with branches and stumps creeping out of the ground. It was pitch black. The trees hugged the road so tightly that even the moonlight barely broke through. My flashlight app wasn't a thing back then, so I made do with the dim glow from a cheap keychain light, its flickering beam bouncing off the uneven ground. It took about 10 minutes to get to my car, a boxy old Volvo 240DL, parked at the bottom of the hill in a small clearing. By the time I reached it, my nerves were already buzzing. Topanga nights are quiet, but not silent. The wind rustles the trees, distant animals cry out, and every little sound feels amplified. It's easy for your mind to start playing tricks on you. I climbed into the car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then I heard it, a noise faint but distinct, rustling, like something moving through the brush nearby. I froze, my hand hovering over the ignition. The first thought that popped into my head was animal. A raccoon, maybe a coyote. Hell, even a bear wasn't out of the question in Topanga. I didn't dare move, though. I didn't even want to breathe too loud. The sound grew closer, a soft padding noise passing just beyond the car. My heart pounded. I peered into the darkness, but the trees were so dense I couldn't see a thing. Whatever it was, it passed the car, and then nothing. The noise stopped. 5 minutes crept by, and I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. When nothing happened, I convinced myself it had just been some harmless animal, and that if it were dangerous, it would have made itself known by now. I turned the key, and the old engine coughed to life. I switched on the headlights, threw the car into drive, and started rolling down the road. And that's when I saw them. I was turning onto one of the wider roads leading out of the canyon when the headlights caught two figures walking slowly along the pavement, heading in the same direction I was driving. They were covered head to toe in black cloth. Jet black, the kind that didn't catch the light or reflect anything. Their bodies were draped like they were wearing cloaks or robes, and they had no shoes. Just bare feet pressing silently against the asphalt. My stomach clenched. The headlights swept over them as I passed, but they didn't react, didn't look toward the car. They just kept walking, slow and deliberate, their heads slightly bowed. The cloth they were wrapped in must have been velvet or something similar, because even as the light hit them, they stayed unnervingly dark, like they absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. I gripped the wheel tighter and floored it. The Volvo rattled as it picked up speed, the engine groaning, but I didn't care. I needed to put distance between myself and whatever the hell I had just seen. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The red glow of the taillights illuminated them briefly before fading into the darkness. They hadn't stopped walking. They hadn't changed pace. Just two figures, dressed in black, moving through the canyon like they belonged to it. That's when it hit me. If I'd left my girlfriend's house even 30 seconds later, I would have walked right into them on that narrow, pitch-black road. I would have been alone on foot, with no way to see them until it was too late. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine, the kind you can feel deep in your bones. I don't know what they were doing, who they were, or why they were there. Maybe it was a prank, or some kind of ritual, or maybe just a strange coincidence. But the way they moved, slow and silent, in the dead of night, made it feel like something out of a dream or a nightmare. I couldn't shake the image of them, the way their forms seemed to blend into the shadows even as my headlights passed over them. Topanga Canyon is full of weird stories, and I'd heard my fair share growing up. But that night, as I sped away from those two figures, I felt like I just lived one of my own. Story 8. Exploring abandoned buildings at night was something my friends and I used to do more often than I'd admit. It wasn't just for the thrill, it was the sense of stepping into a forgotten story, the remnants of a place stuck in time. Suffolk County had plenty of spots for urban explorers, but the abandoned psych hospital was the one we always talked about. It had this reputation, like its walls were holding on to something, and that curiosity kept drawing us back. We'd snuck in once before, but this time was different. It was nighttime. That added weight to everything. The shadows seemed thicker, and the air felt colder inside the cracked walls. The moment we stepped through a patient room window to get in, I felt the difference. This wasn't some casual adventure. It felt like the kind of place that didn't want to be disturbed. The first section we checked out was the building that housed the cafeteria and, to our surprise, a bowling alley. It wasn't as creepy as you'd think. More surreal, really. A few broken tables, shattered tiles, a couple of bowling lanes strewn with debris. It was a mess, sure, but it didn't have the heaviness we'd felt walking in. For a while we were laughing, cracking jokes about ghosts using bowling balls as weapons, that kind of thing. But as the night stretched on, that humor faded. The silence settled deeper, the building seeming to close in around us. After an hour or so of exploring, we decided it was time to head out. None of us wanted to linger long enough to push our luck. The plan was to leave the same way we came in, through the patient room window near the entrance. That's when it hit me. My flashlight. I'd left it back in an adjacent patient room while we were poking around earlier. My friends rolled their eyes when I told them, but said they'd wait by the exit. "Just grab it quick," Ryan said. "Don't disappear." "Got it," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant as I stepped back into the hallway. My footsteps echoed more than I expected, like the building itself was listening. I made my way to the room, the one just around the corner. The flashlight wasn't far, I knew that much, so I wasn't worried. Or at least I wasn't until I reached the door. It was closed. I stopped. We hadn't been closing any doors. The whole time we'd been here, we left things exactly as we found them. I stared at the door for a moment, my pulse quickening. Maybe one of my friends had been messing around earlier and forgot, or maybe it had shifted on its own. Buildings like this creak and settle all the time. That had to be it, right? Then I noticed something else. Light. Faint but unmistakable. A flicker coming from the other side of the door, casting thin shadows through the cracks. I froze, my stomach dropping as the possibilities hit me. No one had flashlights but us. No one else was supposed to be here. And yet there it was. Movement, just beyond that door. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I didn't think twice. I turned on my heel and sprinted back to the others, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I barely registered their confused looks as I reached the window and practically dove out, gasping for breath. "What happened?" Ryan asked, his voice tinged with concern. Nothing," I managed to stammer. "Just, someone's in there." I didn't stick around to explain. We made our way back to the car as fast as we could, the silence of the psych hospital pressing against our backs the entire way. Even after we'd driven far enough to leave it behind, I couldn't shake the image of that flickering light, the thought of who or what might have been standing on the other side of that door. I didn't go back after that. None of us did. Exploring abandoned places had always been our thing, but that night reminded me that some spaces aren't empty, and sometimes it's better not to find out what's waiting in the dark. Story 9. The snow was fresh, unbroken except for the prints we left as we trudged through the empty lot. It was one of those nights where the air felt sharp against your face, the cold biting but manageable. The rehab center had been abandoned for years just outside of town, a sprawling collection of buildings half hidden by overgrown trees and crumbling fences. I was with two friends, Chris and Megan, and exploring places like this had become a weekend ritual for us. We thought we'd seen it all, old factories, forgotten houses, the occasional school, but that night was different. It had started snowing while we were inside the first building, just light flurries at first, but enough to coat the ground by the time we made our way to the second structure. This one looked less like a rehab center and more like a house, though it was hard to tell with how much of it had deteriorated over the years. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the roof sagged as if the whole thing was ready to collapse at any moment. As we approached the entrance, I glanced down and stopped. "Guys," I said, my voice low. Chris and Megan turned. I pointed to the ground. There, leading straight to the door we were about to enter, was a set of footprints. Large, unmistakably from boots, men's boots judging by the size, and so fresh that the edges hadn't softened under the falling snow. They went right up to the door and disappeared inside. "Looks like someone beat us here," Chris muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. Megan frowned. "Could be someone squatting, or..." She didn't finish the thought, but we all knew what she meant. It could have been anyone, some curious explorer like us, or someone looking for a place to sleep, or someone who didn't want to be found. We debated whether to turn back right then, but curiosity won out. We'd come prepared, as always. Megan had her pepper spray, Chris carried a sturdy flashlight that could double as a club if needed, and I had a small pocket knife tucked in my jacket. Stupid as it might sound, we thought we were ready for anything. So we pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of your own breathing. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, and our flashlights cut through the darkness to reveal what looked like an old living room. The furniture was long gone, replaced by debris, broken glass, scraps of wood, old cans scattered across the floor. The footprints continued inside, leading deeper into the building. Chris took the lead, his flashlight beam steady as he followed the trail. We moved slowly, our footsteps crunching softly against the scattered debris. The prints led us to a staircase, narrow and rickety, that disappeared into the shadows above. "Should we?" Chris asked, glancing back at us. "We've come this far," Megan said, though her voice was quieter now. The stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended, the sound echoing faintly through the building. At the top, we found ourselves in what looked like a small loft. The ceiling was low, sloping sharply on one side, where the roof dipped down, and the space was empty except for a few rusted bed frames shoved against the walls. The footprints stopped here, but there was no one in sight. "Where'd they go?" I whispered, my heart pounding. That's when Megan spotted it, the makeshift door. Someone had cut a rough opening into the far wall, leading into what must have been the attic. The edges of the opening were jagged, the wood splintered as if it had been hacked through in a hurry, and the space beyond was pitch black. Chris stepped closer, shining his flashlight inside. The beam revealed nothing at first, just a narrow crawl space filled with dust and cobwebs. He hesitated, then slowly pushed the door open farther. The faint sound of the wood scraping against the frame made my skin crawl. "Hello?" Chris called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. No answer. He crouched down and shined his flashlight deeper into the attic. The light caught a few objects, what looked like an old blanket, a pair of shoes, and an empty can of beans. Signs that someone had been here, maybe even recently, but the space was empty now, or at least it seemed that way. "This is weird," Megan said, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear behind us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, even though every logical part of me said we were. The attic was still, the air thick with dust, but the fact that we hadn't seen or heard anyone, that whoever had made those footprints had simply vanished, set my nerves on edge. "I don't like this," I said finally. "Let's go." Chris didn't argue, and Megan was already making her way back toward the stairs. We descended quickly, the wooden steps groaning under our weight, and retraced our path through the building. Every shadow felt like it was watching us. Every small sound felt amplified. By the time we stepped back outside, the cold air was a relief. The footprints were still there, leading to the door we just exited, but there were no others, no trail leading away from the building, no sign that anyone else had left. We stood there for a moment, staring at the tracks in silence, until Megan finally spoke. "Let's not do this again," she said, her voice shaky. I nodded. "Agreed." We didn't talk much on the way back, each of us lost in our own thoughts. That night, as I lay in bed replaying everything in my head, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints leading into the building. Whoever had made them was there, somewhere, but we never saw them. And that, more than anything, is what creeped me out the most. I haven't been back to that rehab since. And honestly, I'm okay never finding out what or who was in that attic. Story 10. When I was a kid, the storm drainage system under our neighborhood became the ultimate summer adventure. You'd think crawling through dark, wet pipes would freak us out, but it felt more like stepping into a secret world. The entrances were tight. You had to shimmy through 15 or 20 feet of claustrophobic crawl space before reaching tunnels big enough to stand in. From there, it opened into this sprawling, echoing maze. Some areas were massive, with ceilings so high we joked about putting a basketball hoop down there. Other spots had creepy features, like grates with steel bars that looked like prison cells, cutting across the middle of the tunnels. The weirdest part, it was silent except for the trickle of water. Any noise, a drip, a shuffle, felt like it didn't belong. Most of us got good at navigating without maps. There was a system. If you got lost, you kept following the biggest pipes. They eventually led about half a mile out of the neighborhood, where the tunnel dumped into a creek and pond and a steep 15-foot drop. But there were always new paths to try. Most of us stuck to the main routes, but my older brother wasn't like that. He wanted to see everything, and one day, that almost went very, very wrong. It was one of those hot summer afternoons when you could practically hear the sun frying the pavement above us. My brother, his two friends, me, and a couple of other neighborhood kids climbed down into the tunnels, flashlights in hand, ready to explore. We reached one of the main junctions where several pipes split off. Most of us hung out there, resting, laughing, shining our beams around at the graffiti left by other kids over the years. But my brother, always the fearless one, decided to push farther. "There's this smaller tunnel no one's checked out yet," he said, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Let's see where it goes." I glanced at the others. They shrugged, but I stayed behind with two friends pretending it was out of boredom. The truth was, I had a bad feeling. I couldn't explain it, but the idea of going down that particular tunnel made my stomach tighten. So I watched as my brother and two of his friends disappeared into the darkness. 10, maybe 15 minutes passed. We joked, threw rocks into the trickling water, talked about random stuff to pass the time. Then faintly at first we heard it, the sound of footsteps, running, fast. My friend froze, her eyes darting toward the tunnel my brother had gone down. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the echoes turned into shouting, terrified shouting. My heart dropped as the voices grew louder, closer. They weren't words at first, just raw fear. And then, clear as day, I heard one of my brother's friends scream, "Go!" My two friends bolted without a second thought, heading straight for the biggest tunnel. I stood frozen, torn between staying and running. But then I heard it again. More footsteps, louder, closer, and finally my brother's voice, panicked, shouting my name. That was all it took. I turned and ran, my flashlight barely illuminating the way as I followed my friends. The tunnel seemed endless. Every sound felt amplified, the slap of our sneakers on wet concrete, the echo of our breath, the pounding of my pulse. My flashlight beam bounced wildly off the walls, casting strange shadows that made me think, just for a second, that something was chasing us. I didn't dare look back. Finally, light. The tunnel widened, and we saw the opening up ahead, where it emptied into the creek. One by one, we reached the edge and didn't stop. We jumped into the air and plummeted the 15 feet into the pond below. The water was freezing, but I didn't care. I kicked and splashed my way to the bank, gasping for air. Seconds later, my brother and his friends shot out of the pipe like bullets. They didn't say a word, just scrambled onto the shore, soaked and shaking. I thought for a moment it might have been some elaborate prank. But then I saw my brother's face, white as a sheet, his eyes wide with something I'd never seen in him before. Genuine fear. "What happened?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Not here," he snapped. "Just go home." We walked the mile back to our house in complete silence, dripping wet, my heart still racing. When we finally got there, my brother did something he never did. He told my mom everything. He explained where we'd been, what we'd been doing, and why we were soaked. Then in a quiet, trembling voice, he told her what they'd seen. We never went back into those tunnels. None of us ever wanted to. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.